Into the abyss, a sailor's nightmare. Setting sail. I write this account not for absolution nor understanding. God knows those things are far from me now. Instead, I write to purge myself of the images that haunt me still, the sounds that echo in every waking and sleeping hour. They say no sailor returns unchanged, and that to voyage upon the sea is to court a sort of madness. Perhaps they were right. The day we set sail, it was with little fanfare. The Atlantic stretched before us in all its vast indifference, steel grey and inscrutable. Our ship, the Arcadia, was an old thing. Her timbers creaked in every shift of wind and wave, her hull bearing the scars of storms long past. She wasn't much to look at, but to men like us, hardened sailors with few ties to anything but the sea, she was home. I recall her aging masts groaning as we readied for departure, a sound like some elderly creature awakening from slumber, hesitant to face the light of another day. The crew was a rough bunch, some more seasoned than others. Among them was Jenkins, a grizzled figure with a nose like a hawk's beak and eyes that had seen more storms than most men twice his age. Jenkins could laugh at danger, could make a mockery of any warning. Yet that day, as we cast off from the harbour, even he seemed subdued, casting wary glances at the sky, as if he saw something there the rest of us couldn't. There were others. Young Billy, barely 20, and on his first voyage. Larkin, a surly figure who kept mostly to himself. And Fitz, whose nervous tics grew worse the farther we sailed. In that motley assembly, I felt neither camaraderie nor fear, only the steady detachment of years at sea. I knew these men only as fixtures in the long, repetitive process of setting sail, faces in a memory, part of the journey itself. The sky was clear, deceptively so, yet as the hours slipped by and we headed farther from land, a strange stillness settled over the water. The usual calls of gulls grew faint until they were gone altogether, replaced by a silence that clung to the air like mist. The wind fell slack, and the sea, unnaturally still, mirrored the pale grey clouds above. That calmness grew more oppressive by the hour, an unbroken monotony that felt, somehow, like the first portent of something sinister. Jenkins was the first to remark on it. "There's a strange bite in the air," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "Feels like a storm brewing, even if the sky says otherwise." But as we drifted deeper into that quiet expanse, I could feel something shift within me, a sense of foreboding I hadn't known in years. This wasn't just the usual trepidation of a sailor on a winter voyage. It was as though the sea itself held a dark, unspeakable secret, one that lurked just beneath its placid surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. Winter descended upon us slowly, as if reluctant to show its full power. The cold crept in on silent feet, slithering through every seam and crack, settling into our bones until even the heartiest among us grew sluggish. The sky had long since turned grey, the clouds a thick, unmoving sheet above us, casting a leaden light that seemed to sap the colour from everything it touched. I took my night shifts in silence, patrolling the deck beneath dim lantern light, watching the sea ripple black and endless on every side. That was when the voices began, faint and indistinct, borne upon the wind, or so I told myself. Sometimes they were no more than whispers, faint as the hiss of waves against the hull. Other times, I swore I could make out words, fragments of phrases, laughter. Once, I heard the unmistakable cry of a child, faint but piercing, somewhere beyond the darkness. My heart would leap, my pulse pounding as I peered into the night, but there was never anyone there. My mind raced, filling in what my eyes could not see. I had been at sea long enough to know that solitude can play tricks, that the mind reaches for sounds, forms, companions to ward off the cold emptiness. Yet each night, as the wind bit deeper, those voices grew louder, more insistent, until I found myself waiting for them, straining to hear them. The men grew quieter, their faces taut and drawn, hands trembling even in the slightest breeze. One night, as we huddled for warmth in the galley, Jenkins leaned in close, his voice no more than a whisper. "Strange things happen at sea," he said. His eyes were distant, unfocused. "Things you wouldn't believe. They say there's places the sea doesn't want you, places where it remembers." I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out hollow. Jenkins' words lingered in the stale, smoke-laden air, settling into our silence like an uninvited guest. After that, I took my watch in a solitude so profound it felt suffocating, as though the sea itself were closing in, blocking out the world. Each shadow seemed to move, each ripple in the water, a silent watcher. And then came the first wave. It was as if the sea itself had held its breath, waiting for that moment to unleash its fury. I saw it coming, an enormous swell, rising out of the darkness, a wall of black water that seemed to tower over the ship, casting us in shadow. Time froze, each heartbeat a deafening echo in my ears as I braced against the railing, feeling the rumbling grow louder, closer. The wave hit with a force that shook me to my core, wrenching the ship like a toy in the hands of a vengeful child. Water cascaded over the deck, icy and relentless, dragging men and barrels alike into its depths. My hands gripped the railing, knuckles white, and I could feel the icy sting of salt water as it tore at my skin, its touch almost sentient. As the wave receded, leaving the deck awash in seawater and debris, I caught a glimpse of something beneath the surface. Just a fleeting shape, blurred and distorted, yet unmistakably human. It drifted there, a pale face barely visible in the churning water, eyes open and staring, mouth wide in a silent scream. I blinked, heart racing, but when I looked again, it was gone. The first rogue wave. The ship was still trembling from the first monstrous wave, and so were we. Around me, the crew was slowly gathering their wits, shaking themselves free of shock. Men stumbled to their feet, clutching rails and barrels, looking pale and haunted, eyes darting to the sky and back to the water, as if seeking some explanation in its depthless expanse. I was still grasping the railing, staring at the place where I'd glimpsed that face. A memory burned into my mind. Pale and cold, its mouth open in a way that seemed to echo with a silent scream. It hadn't been the look of a corpse drifting at peace. No, there was something worse in that expression. It was a face that remembered suffering, one that had been dragged down, deep into the ocean's darkness, and left there to rot and watch the world above. Around me, the others didn't seem to have seen it. They were muttering to one another, inspecting the damage, but I could tell they were shaken. One by one, they raised their eyes to the water, as if it might strike again, their movements slower, deliberate, as though the ocean was watching us, and any sudden movement might provoke it. No one spoke of what they'd seen in the wave's aftermath. Instead, the men began to mutter among themselves in hushed tones, eyes averted, hands shaking as they ran ropes through their fingers or tightened knots that didn't need tightening. Jenkins, the seasoned sailor, remained quiet, but I could see it in his face, that he'd felt it too, the dark presence we'd glimpsed when the wave rose. In those hours after the wave struck, an uneasy silence took hold. Even the air felt weighted, charged, and the men hardly dared to breathe too loudly. The light was fading, and in the growing shadows, we worked with fumbling hands, silent and obedient, mending what we could. But even as we worked, I kept feeling eyes on me. It was a sensation I couldn't shake, a prickling at the back of my neck that forced me to glance around, hoping, always hoping, that I would see nothing but water and crew and sky. But each time I looked, the emptiness felt less empty, as though the ocean itself was leaning in, coming close enough that I could hear its whispers, its voice. Hours bled together, the vast grey sky pressing down as if trying to swallow us whole. and the sea seemed to agree. We drifted in silence. The ocean had returned to a deceptive calm, the waves gentle and undisturbed, as if they were resting before another brutal strike. But the air was different. It felt thick, charged, almost as though the storm wasn't over, but lying in wait, watching to see how we'd respond. A tense, hushed quiet had settled over the crew. No one spoke above a whisper. No one dared break the strange spell. I watched my crewmates from the shadows, each of them shifting uncomfortably, as though they too felt the weight of the ocean bearing down on us, whispering something unspeakable into our ears. Jenkins, usually quick to fill the silence with crude jokes or stories of past storms, was deathly quiet. I saw him staring out at the water, eyes wide, his face pale as he twisted his cap in his hands, a nervous habit I'd never seen in him before. He seemed to sense my stare, glancing over with a haunted look. His voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. I don't like this one, lad," he said, his eyes flitting back to the water. "There's something wrong here, something in the air. It's like the ocean itself has gone cold." He shook his head, muttering to himself, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. I wanted to shrug it off, to tell him it was just the nerves, the exhaustion, the endless expanse of the Atlantic playing tricks on us. But deep down, I felt it too. There was something about this calm that felt unnatural, like a creature coiling before a strike. That night, as I took my place on watch, the silence grew heavier, suffocating. The wind had died entirely, leaving the ship adrift in the dark. I tried to focus on my duties, forcing myself to ignore the creeping sense of dread, the oppressive quiet. But as the hours passed, the silence became a thing of its own, pressing down on me, a weight I could feel in my lungs, my chest. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I found myself staring over my shoulder, my heart pounding each time I thought I heard a whisper on the wind. Then, the laughter began. It started as a faint, almost indiscernible sound, a single laugh carried by the breeze. I froze, straining my ears, waiting. Another laugh drifted over the water, quiet and strange, as though from a child. It echoed in the darkness, lingering just out of reach. I blinked, trying to shake the sound from my ears, convincing myself it was nothing more than the wind. But it persisted. Faint whispers, laughter, voices just at the edge of hearing. They seemed to drift from the sea itself, carried on the waves, growing louder until it felt as though someone were right beside me, murmuring into my ear. I could make out words, half-formed and ghostly, phrases that drifted just out of comprehension, yet left a chill in my bones. It was maddening, a symphony of sound that seemed to seep into my mind, filling every corner with fragments of speech, broken and unintelligible. And in that moment, I felt a terror so profound, it seemed to reach into my soul. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever, as if the very ocean was aware of me, was studying me, waiting for me to falter. The voices grew louder, mingling with laughter, rising and falling in a strange rhythm that echoed with a kind of dark, mocking joy. I squeezed my eyes shut, covering my ears, willing it to stop, praying it would go away. But the whispers continued, ebbing and flowing with the rhythm of the sea, seeping into my mind until it felt as though I would go mad with it. The ship was silent, the ocean as still as glass, and yet the laughter continued, filling the night air with its haunting cadence. I opened my eyes, breath coming in short, frantic gasps, and saw Jenkins staring at me from across the deck, his face pale and wide-eyed. "You hear it too, don't you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. And in his eyes, I saw my own terror reflected back at me, a terror that felt as deep as the ocean, as dark and endless as the sea stretching out before us. There was no more denying it. Something was out there, watching us, something ancient and patient and filled with malice. and it wanted us to know. The eerie calm that had settled over us stretched into hours, every second laced with a tension thick enough to feel. The whispers seemed to have faded, but they left behind a shadow in my mind, a creeping dread that clawed at the edges of reason. As night settled in, I found myself on the deck, staring out at the silent waves that mirrored a sky heavy with dark, threatening clouds. I wasn't the only one. Jenkins and a few others had gathered as well, silent and tense, as though bracing for an impact we couldn't yet see. I felt it before I saw it. A low rumble resonated beneath us, like the growl of a beast stirring from slumber. The deck shivered underfoot, and the air shifted, cold and electric, prickling against my skin. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as a faint vibration passed through the ship's boards, growing stronger with every second. The men around me fell silent, eyes wide, gripping the rails as though that would keep them grounded in reality. Then, in the distance, a shadow rose. At first, it was barely distinguishable from the night itself, a darker line on the horizon. But it grew, steadily and unnervingly, swelling upward in the same terrible silence. My mouth went dry as I watched it, feeling the pull of that towering wave like the call of a nightmare. I wanted to shout, to scream, but the words stuck in my throat, and I could do nothing but stare as it loomed closer. The wave was colossal, a black wall of water that blotted out the sky, blotting out reason itself. It rose so high that the stars seemed to disappear behind it, and for a heart-stopping moment, it hung there, suspended, as if deciding our fate. A shudder passed through me, a chill deeper than the cold Atlantic air. There was something in the water, a shadow lurking within the wave, something twisting and writhing just beneath its surface. My breath hitched as I glimpsed a flash of pale flesh, elongated and distorted, eyes that gleamed like dying stars, staring back at me from the depths. It was then that I knew we were being watched. The ocean itself had taken notice of us, and whatever lay beneath that surface, it was aware. The wave crashed down, and the world exploded into chaos. The force of it hit like a freight train, the impact throwing me against the railing, the breath knocked out of me as icy water surged over the deck, tearing ropes free and sending barrels spinning. The ship groaned, its timbers creaking under the strain, as though it too were crying out in agony. My fingers clung to the railing, my arms aching as the torrent threatened to drag me under, to pull me into that terrible dark abyss where those eyes waited. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see anything beyond the wall of water and the faint outline of my crewmates, struggling and thrashing like trapped animals. Someone screamed, a raw, guttural sound that cut through the roar of the wave. I turned just in time to see Jenkins, his face twisted in terror, swept off his feet and carried toward the edge. His eyes met mine for one harrowing instant, a silent plea, before the ocean claimed him, pulling him down into the depths. And then it was gone. The wave passed, leaving us gasping and clinging to whatever we could find. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive. My fingers were numb, raw from gripping the rail, and every bone in my body ached. Around me, the remaining crew staggered to their feet, faces pale, eyes wide and haunted. We were fewer now, and the ones who remained wore expressions of horror that mirrored my own. The ocean was quiet again, but it was no longer the calm, indifferent expanse I'd once known. It felt alive, watchful, filled with something dark and ancient that had claimed Jenkins and would claim the rest of us if it chose. The days that followed were a blur of silence and fear. We moved through the ship like ghosts, avoiding each other's eyes, each of us haunted by our own visions and memories. The storm had subsided, but the weight of it lingered, pressing down on us with a palpable heaviness. None of us spoke of Jenkins or the others who had been lost to the waves. It was as though their memory had been swallowed along with them, leaving only an emptiness that settled into our bones. That night, the whispers returned. I was alone on watch, staring out at the waves as they lapped against the hull, each ripple a reminder of the horrors we'd endured. I had nearly convinced myself that I'd imagined the laughter, that the voices had been nothing more than the wind playing tricks on a tired mind. But then, soft and unmistakable, I heard it again. A voice, faint and distant, drifting across the water. It was low, almost a murmur, just loud enough to send a chill down my spine. I strained to listen, my heart pounding, hoping, desperately hoping, that it was only the wind. "Come, down," it whispered, a voice as cold and hollow as the grave. My breath caught, and for a moment I felt as though I'd been rooted to the spot, unable to move, to breathe. The voice seemed to echo, growing louder with each repetition, until it filled my mind, drowning out every rational thought. "Come, down." I staggered back, my eyes darting to the water, half expecting to see those pale, ghostly faces rising from the depths, their eyes fixed on me. But the water was empty, dark and still. Only the voice remained, relentless and insistent, calling me to join it. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They came from all sides now, a chorus of whispers that filled the night, each one distinct yet somehow unified, as though they were all part of the same terrible entity. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible. But the voices didn't answer. They only continued their haunting chant, a call that resonated with a kind of dark, malevolent joy, as if they were laughing at my helplessness, my fear. I felt my grip on reality slipping, the boundary between the world of the living and the depths of the ocean growing thin and fragile. The voices began to twist, shifting into the sound of laughter, familiar laughter. It was Jenkins, and then another voice joined, one I didn't recognize, and another still, until they became a cacophony of lost souls, all echoing the same terrible laughter, all calling out to me. I staggered back, clutching at my head, trying to block out the sound. But it was inescapable, a part of me now, a dark and twisted presence that would not let me go. The remaining crew began to notice my behavior, their eyes wary, filled with the same fear I'd seen reflected in my own. They were distant, skittish, as though they could feel the madness creeping into my mind, and perhaps into theirs as well. Some of them began whispering amongst themselves, muttering about curses and ancient gods, old tales of the ocean's wrath that they'd once dismissed as superstition. Now, those tales seemed like the only explanation. Desperation grew, driving some of the men to attempt strange, superstitious rituals in the hope of appeasing whatever force haunted us. They threw coins overboard, murmuring prayers to deities I'd never heard of, casting offerings into the dark water in the hopes of buying their lives back from the abyss. But I knew deep down that it was useless. Whatever was watching us, it wasn't interested in offerings. It wanted something far deeper, something none of us could give. Into the distance, searching for the source of that sound, that bone-deep resonance that felt like it was coming from within the sea itself. I saw it then, rising in the distance, a shadow, darker than the clouds, more profound than the night itself. It moved slowly, as though the ocean were lifting some monstrous creature from its depths, raising it up to tower over us. My throat went dry, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to look away, to run, but my feet were rooted to the deck, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. The wave, no, not just a wave, something alive, something sentient, vast and ancient, loomed before us, a wall of black water stretching so high that it seemed to blot out the sky. I felt its pull, a force as inescapable as gravity, as though the ocean itself were drawing me in, inviting me into its cold, dark embrace. I barely registered the crew's panicked cries, the frenzied scramble as men tried to cling to whatever they could find. But deep down, I knew it was pointless. We were nothing, specks in the face of this monstrous force, insects caught in the storm's path. The wave surged forward, and in that instant, I saw them. Faces, countless faces, pale and distorted, twisted in expressions of terror and agony. They seemed to stare back at me, their eyes empty, hollow, as though they were trapped in some eternal torment, bound to the very water that had claimed them. The wave crashed down, and everything was consumed in darkness. Icy water surged over me, filling my mouth, my lungs, every part of me that had once held air, now replaced by the cold, suffocating embrace of the ocean. The ship creaked and groaned, splintering under the weight of the wave. I felt myself thrown, tossed like driftwood in a storm, my mind a blur of panic and pain. I reached out, grasping blindly, desperate for something, anything, to cling to. My fingers found a piece of debris, a jagged, splintered plank, and I held on, clinging to it with all the strength I had left. I broke the surface, gasping for air, only to be met by the endless expanse of the nightmarish ocean, the twisted wreckage of the ship scattered around me, the faces of the lost crew now staring up from the depths. I felt a presence, a weight pressing down on me, watching me. I glanced down, my breath hitching as I saw them, the ghostly shapes that lurked just beneath the water, circling like predators. They were waiting, their eyes gleaming with a strange, dark hunger, their pale hands reaching out as though to pull me under. But something in me snapped then, a last surge of survival instinct, a spark of defiance that refused to give in. I kicked, fighting against the pull of the water, the lure of the abyss that beckoned below. I could feel it, the darkness clawing at me, grasping, desperate to drag me down into the depths where those other souls waited, but I held on, clinging to my plank, refusing to let go. Time lost all meaning. The world was reduced to the cold, unending ocean, the relentless whisper of the waves, and the weight of those eyes watching, waiting. Days passed, or perhaps only hours. I couldn't tell. My body grew numb, my mind frayed and worn, but I held on, my thoughts consumed by the single desperate desire to survive. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A light, a faint, flickering glow that seemed to cut through the darkness. I squinted, trying to focus, to make sense of what I was seeing, but the light seemed to waver, shifting in and out of view, like a mirage on the horizon. I forced myself to move, to paddle, my muscles aching, my body on the verge of collapse. The light grew brighter, closer, until I could make out the outline of a ship, a real ship, solid and substantial, its sails billowing in the wind. I felt a surge of hope, a wild, desperate hope that pushed me forward, driving me to keep going, to reach that light, to escape the horrors that lurked in the water. But as I drew closer, my heart sank. The ship was wrong. Its sails were tattered, its hull covered in barnacles and seaweed, as though it had been abandoned for years. And yet, it moved with a purpose, its lights flickering like the dying embers of a fire. The crew, if they could even be called that, were shadows, figures shrouded in darkness, their faces obscured, their movements slow and deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't a rescue, it was an invitation to join the ranks of the lost, to become one of the hollow, empty souls who drifted through the endless sea. The ship drew closer, and I felt its pull, that same inexorable force that had tried to drag me down before. I closed my eyes, my mind filled with the faces of my lost crewmates, the haunting whispers, the twisted laughter that still echoed in my ears. I could feel the ocean calling to me, a dark, relentless force that offered no solace, no peace, only an eternity of drowning. When I finally regained some semblance of awareness, I was lying on a bunk, surrounded by strangers. Their faces hovered above me like specters, gazing down with a mix of pity and bewilderment. They spoke to me, voices like muffled echoes, and I couldn't tell if they were real or merely more apparitions conjured by my frayed mind. "Are you alive, mate?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. I blinked, trying to focus, and managed a weak nod. They lifted me, helping me sit upright. I tried to speak, to tell them about the horrors I'd seen, but the words caught in my throat. Even now, the memories felt jagged, splintered. Every time I tried to grasp them, they slipped through my fingers like water. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see them wet with seawater, but they were dry, shaking uncontrollably. "Easy now," one of the sailors murmured, offering me a cup of something hot. I drank without thinking, the warmth searing my throat, anchoring me momentarily to the present. They told me I had been found clinging to a piece of driftwood, delirious and half frozen. They said I'd been mumbling in my sleep, fragments of sentences about faces in the water and voices from the deep. I could feel their eyes on me, curious, maybe even frightened, as if they sensed the darkness that still clung to me, a shadow I couldn't shake. As the days passed, they encouraged me to speak, to share what I had experienced. They'd ask me questions. "What happened to your ship?" Or, "Where is the rest of your crew?" But I had no answers. The memories remained elusive, half-formed images and snatches of sounds that refused to coalesce into anything coherent. And even if I could remember, even if I could find the words, how could I explain it to them? How could I make them understand the horrors lurking just beneath the waves, the invisible forces that pulled men into the depths? I tried to sleep, to find some reprieve from the waking nightmare I was trapped in. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the faces of my lost crewmates, their hollow, empty eyes staring back at me from beneath the water. They were waiting, watching, as though they'd followed me from the wreckage, unwilling to let me escape. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the taste of salt still lingering in my mouth, as though the ocean itself had invaded my very being. On the third night, as I lay awake in my bunk, I heard it again, the whispering. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder, more insistent. It was the same voice I had heard on the deck of the ship, the same chilling murmur that had haunted me as we sailed deeper into the Atlantic. I sat up, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The other men were asleep, their breathing slow and even, oblivious to the spectral sounds that filled the cabin. The whispering grew louder, twisting and curling through the darkness, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out, but the voices seeped through, relentless, inescapable. "You are marked," they seemed to say. "You belong to us." I stumbled out of my bunk, clinging to the wall for support as I made my way to the deck. The night was clear, the stars glittering above like distant, indifferent eyes. But the ocean was dark, darker than I'd ever seen it, a vast, endless expanse of black that stretched out to the horizon. And in the depths, I saw them, faint, ghostly shapes that drifted just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. I backed away, heart pounding, but the whispers followed me, curling around me like tendrils of mist, wrapping me in their cold embrace. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the endless expanse of the sea. Months have passed since that night, but the memory lingers, a weight that I carry with me every waking moment. I'm back on land now, safe, or so they tell me. But there is no safety, no escape from the horrors I witnessed. The ocean haunts me still, a constant, oppressive presence that fills my dreams and shadows my thoughts. I tried to forget, to bury the memories in the far recesses of my mind. But the faces, they linger. I see them everywhere, in the reflections on the water, in the shadows that flit across my vision, in the silent, watchful eyes of strangers who pass me by on the street. I feel their gaze, their cold, accusing stares, as though they're waiting for me to return, to rejoin them in the depths. I've tried to speak of it, to share my experiences with others, but every time I do, I'm met with disbelief, with polite nods and sympathetic smiles that mask a deeper, underlying skepticism. They don't understand. How could they? They've never felt the weight of the ocean pressing down on them, the relentless pull of the abyss. So I write, pouring my memories onto paper in a desperate attempt to exorcise the darkness within me. But the more I write, the clearer it becomes that there is no escape, no release. The words flow, endless, like the waves that carried me to that cursed ship, each sentence a reminder of the horrors I witnessed, the things I can never unsee. And still, the ocean calls to me. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself drawn to the shore, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the endless expanse. I can feel it, the pull, the lure of the depths, the promise of something dark and ancient waiting beneath the waves. It whispers to me, beckoning, inviting me to return, to join the lost souls who drift through the ocean's embrace. I don't know how much longer I can resist. There are days when I feel as though I am already lost, as though a part of me has never left that ship, never escaped the cold, relentless grip of the ocean. I am haunted, not just by the memories of my crewmates, but by the sense that I am marked, claimed by forces beyond my understanding. The ocean is patient. It waits, biding its time, knowing that one day I will return. And when that day comes, I will go willingly, a willing sacrifice to the darkness that lurks beneath the waves. Because deep down, I know that I am already lost, a hollow shell, a shadow of the man I once was. I am a sailor adrift, forever bound to the sea, to the endless, inescapable abyss.